Does your language make you sexist? Research covering 111 countries suggests the answer might be yes. A massive 15 percentage point gap in female labor force participation exists between countries with gendered languages and those without. That's potentially 125 million women worldwide affected by something as abstract as grammar. But here's the twist. Iceland and Norway rank at the top for gender equality, yet they use heavily gendered grammar. Meanwhile, countries like Turkey use gender-neutral languages but have different societal outcomes. Even Finnish speakers, who lack grammatical gender entirely, still default to male interpretations in experiments. So what's really going on? Is grammar quietly shaping how we think about men and women? Or is this all just correlation masquerading as causation? In this video, we'll examine the evidence from cross-national data, controlled experiments, and real-world language reform movements. And the answer is far more nuanced than you might expect. Before we dive into the evidence, let's clarify what we're actually talking about. Grammatical gender is a linguistic classification system that assigns nouns to categories, typically masculine, feminine, and sometimes neuter. In Romance languages like Spanish or French, every single noun carries a gender marking. El libro, the book, masculine. La mesa, the table, feminine. This is fundamentally different from social gender, which refers to the roles and identities we associate with being male, female, or non-binary. And here's the strange part. Grammatical gender is almost completely arbitrary. There's no logical reason why sun should be masculine in Spanish, el sol, but feminine in German, die Sonne. A table doesn't have feminine characteristics. But this arbitrary system starts to matter when it intersects with actual people. El abogado, male lawyer. La abogada, female lawyer. Suddenly, grammar isn't just about objects anymore. This brings us to one of the most debated ideas in linguistics, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also known as linguistic relativity. The strong version claims that language determines thought. If your language lacks a word for a concept, you literally cannot think it. The weak version suggests language influences cognition without completely determining it. Modern linguists have largely abandoned the strong version. You can obviously think about concepts your language doesn't have specific words for. But the weak version? That's where the real debate lives. Applied to gender, linguistic relativity asks, does speaking a language with binary grammatical gender train your brain to see the world in more gender-binary terms? Does constantly categorizing everything as masculine or feminine make those categories more mentally prominent? And critically, does this translate into actual discriminatory behavior? It's not just an academic question. In 2026, debates over gender-inclusive language have become cultural battlegrounds. The question of whether language shapes our gender attitudes has real-world consequences for millions of people. Languages vary dramatically in how they encode gender. At one extreme, you have binary grammatical gender languages like Spanish, French, Italian, and Arabic, where masculine and feminine markers appear throughout every sentence. Then there are three gender systems like German and Russian, which add a neuter category. In the middle are natural gender languages like English, with gendered pronouns, he, she, but not gendered nouns. And at the other end, fully genderless languages like Finnish, Turkish, Chinese, and Indonesian, where gender is only expressed when specifically needed. About 38% of the world's population speaks a gendered language as their native tongue. That's roughly 3 billion people whose daily speech constantly activates gender categories. So what does the global data actually show? One influential study analyzed 111 countries using the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, which measures parity across economic participation, education, health, and political power. The results were striking. Countries with gendered languages scored an average of 0.67 on the index, where 1.0 equals full parity. Countries with natural gender languages like English scored 0.72. Genderless language countries scored 0.70. The gap was particularly pronounced in economic participation. Gendered language countries showed significantly lower female labor force participation and leadership representation. Another study by World Bank economists went further, analyzing over 4,000 languages covering 99% of the world's population. They found that grammatical gender correlates with a 15 percentage point gap in female labor force participation. But here's the critical question. Correlation isn't causation. Language families cluster geographically and historically. Romance languages are spoken in Catholic-majority countries with shared colonial histories. How much of this correlation is actually about language versus culture, religion, or economics? To separate linguistic effects from cultural factors, researchers designed within-country studies. They analyzed countries where both gendered and genderless indigenous languages coexist: Kenya, Niger, Nigeria, Uganda, and India. Same country, same government, same legal system, different languages. The findings? Even within the same country, women whose native language was gendered had lower educational attainment and lower labor force participation. This is stronger evidence because it controls for national institutions and economic structures. The language effect appears real, though modest. The most compelling evidence comes from experimental manipulation. Political scientists conducted a study in Estonia where they randomly assigned bilingual respondents to take surveys in either Estonian, a genderless language, or Russian, a gendered language. Same people, same questions, different language. The results were significant. Respondents interviewed in Estonian expressed more support for gender equality policies. Those interviewed in Russian endorsed more traditional gender roles. The effects were strongest for questions explicitly about gender, parental leave, and quotas for women in parliament. The theory? Gendered languages increase how mentally prominent gender distinctions become moment to moment. They make gender categories more accessible in your thinking, reinforcing perceptions of natural differences between sexes. Genderless languages minimize this effect, reducing how prominently gender features in your thoughts. At this point, you'd expect a clear answer, but here's where it gets strange. If gendered language causes sexism, how do we explain the Nordic countries? Iceland ranks first globally on gender equality. Finland ranks second, Norway third, Sweden sixth. All of them have grammatical gender systems. So what's going on? The answer: strong policy overrides linguistic structure. Nordic success stems from deliberate institutional intervention, subsidized childcare, and generous parental leave. Gender quotas requiring 40% female representation on corporate boards, progressive taxation, and strong welfare states that reduce economic barriers. Cultural norms emphasizing equality shaped by 1970s feminist movements. The Nordic model proves that when you have strong institutional frameworks promoting equality, grammar becomes far less influential. Language shapes attitudes, but it's just one variable among many. And this is where the simple solution completely falls apart. Here's what makes this even more interesting. Finland achieves equality through policy, but that doesn't erase deep cognitive patterns. Finnish and Turkish, despite having no grammatical gender whatsoever, still show massive male as default bias. Researchers tested whether gender-neutral pronouns activated male or female associations in controlled experiments. In Finland, 71.7% defaulted to male. In Turkey, 80.8%. Critically, this happened equally in Finland, ranked second globally on institutional gender equality, and Turkey ranked 132nd. Even gender-neutral languages aren't neutral. The male as default bias runs deeper than grammar. It's embedded in culture, cognition, and who holds visibility in society. Simply removing grammatical gender doesn't eliminate this default. If language influences gender attitudes, can we change language to change minds? This question has ignited culture wars worldwide. In Spanish-speaking countries, activists pioneered lenguaje inclusivo, inclusive language. Instead of todos, for everyone, use todes with a neutral e ending. The response from Spain's Royal Academy has been swift and harsh. They argue that the use of the letter e is alien to Spanish morphology and unnecessary, as the masculine grammatical form already functions as an inclusive term. France's battle is even more intense. Feminists advocate for l'écriture inclusive, using special characters to show both genders. The Académie Française declared this a mortal danger to the French language. The debate has become viciously polarized. Progressive movements see inclusive language as essential for transgender and non-binary visibility. Conservatives see it as linguistic imperialism that violates natural language evolution. But there's one remarkable success story: Sweden's gender-neutral pronoun hen. First proposed in 1966, it was reintroduced in 2012 and added to Sweden's official dictionary in 2015. Hen serves as a generic pronoun when gender is unknown or irrelevant, and as a pronoun for non-binary individuals. Why did hen succeed where other reforms failed? Sweden is a small, highly digitalized society where innovations spread rapidly online. Swedes see linguistic innovation as aligned with their national values of equality. Despite initial resistance, mainstream outlets eventually embraced it. Experimental studies show that using hen increases non-binary categorization and reduces bias toward traditional gender roles. But Swedish linguists caution that hen's success required unique cultural conditions. You can't simply export the Swedish model to France or Argentina and expect the same results. Why such fierce resistance to language reform? Psychologists identify 3 threat perceptions driving backlash. First, threat to investment in gendered norms. People who've built identities around traditional roles feel those investments undermined. Second, threat to personal gender identity. Linguistic changes can trigger anxiety about identity categories. Third, threat to in-group resources, framed as zero-sum competition over jobs and social recognition. Language reform faces 3 possible paths: institutional resistance, as in France and Spain, where prescriptive academies block change; grassroots success, as in Sweden, where cultural alignment enables mainstream adoption; or contested terrain, as in Germany and English-speaking countries, where reforms are adopted by progressive institutions but remain polarizing in broader society. So, does your language make you sexist? The honest answer: language is not destiny, but it's not innocent either. Grammatical gender doesn't cause sexism in a straightforward way. Gender inequality arises from economics, politics, religion, history, and culture. But gendered grammar amplifies existing attitudes by making gender mentally prominent and creating unconscious biases. Language didn't create patriarchy, but it helps sustain it by making gender distinctions feel natural and inevitable. The evidence shows us 3 things. First, the Nordic countries prove strong institutions can override linguistic influence. Second, gender-neutral languages prove that removing grammar doesn't eliminate male as default thinking. Third, language reform works when cultural conditions support it, not when it's imposed from above. The real question isn't whether your language makes you sexist, it's this: knowing that language shapes thought in subtle but persistent ways, what will you do about it? If this video made you think differently, subscribe for more deep dives into how language shapes our world. Thanks for watching.